Hi, I'm Stephen Turton, and this is Etymology Support. First question. Samuel M8005670 asks, I have a semi-serious question for etymologists. If feet is the plural for foot, why is beat not the plural of boot? Is it because of the vegetable? Foot belongs to a category of words that derive from Old English in which to make the plural, you change the vowel in the word. So other words in this category are tooth, teeth, and goose, geese, mouse, mice. Book also used to be in this category in Old English, but later on we regularized the spelling, so it's book, books. If we kept the Old English pattern, it would now be one book, two beach. The word boot, on the other hand, is not from Old English. It was borrowed from French into Middle English, which is why it just gets the default plural s. There are lots of different ways of pluralizing nouns in Old English, so you might form the plural by changing the vowel in the base word, or you might form the plural by adding a suffix, which could be as, an, u, ru. In the Middle English period, most of these ways of forming the plural fell out of use and the S plural came to predominate. So it basically replaced the old plurals for a lot of English words, just because it was easier. Charfo asks, weird etymology question. When and why did whoops/oops become the default sound made when making a mistake? So whoops is actually more recent than you might think. The earliest evidence we have of whoops being used in writing dates to the 19th century. It actually seems to have been derived from oopsie-daisy, which we have slightly earlier evidence for. Oopsie-daisy might have been a kind of whimsical alteration of lackadaisy, which is in turn a whimsical alteration of alackaday, which is in turn a whimsical alteration of alack, which is a very old way of saying, oh no. This is from the Finding Fens Gold subreddit. Origin of the word clue. Clue originally meant a ball of thread. Then, during Middle English, it came to be associated with the Greek myth of Theseus, who used a ball of thread to find his way in and out of the Minotaur's labyrinth by unspooling it on the way in and then following it back out. From this, a clue came to mean something that helped lead you to a solution to a problem. And that is now the only meaning which is common in English today. Ronald BBK asks, silent letters in words don't make any sense. How about you just don't add the letter in the word? So there are a couple of reasons that silent letters exist in English. One is that the pronunciation of the language has changed and the spelling system just hasn't kept up with it. For example, the GH in words like through and thought and night. The GH exists there because that sound used to be pronounced. In Old English and Middle English, that was the velar fricative. Eventually, because that's quite a difficult sound to pronounce, it dropped out of the language, but we continue to spell words with that GH through a process of sheer inertia. There have been calls for spelling reform in English for literally centuries. In the 19th century, one author complained that the word fish might as well be spelled G-H-O-T-I. GH as in the F at the end of rough, O as in the I in women, and T-I as in the sh in mention. Now, in reality, no one would actually spell fish this way because we know that there are implicit rules to where letter combinations can go in words. So we know that GH can stand for the sound f, but only at the end of a word, as in rough, enough, tough. There was also a moment in time where a word like mention would have been pronounced mentian or something like that. But the T-I-O-N in English, if you say it enough times over and over, tian, 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 chien, chin, chin, shin, it just becomes a lot easier to say shin. So T-I becomes sh. Ease of articulation is a common trigger for sound change in English and other languages. Krauser asks, why do question words why, who, where, when, etc. all start with WH? So this goes all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, which is the earliest ancestor of the English language and many other European and Asian languages that etymologists have been able to reconstruct. Proto-Indo-European had an interrogative stem, an element of a word that would go into building other words that looked something like qui. And this and its variants were used to coin question words. And this qui survives into many modern languages. So for example, in French and Spanish as QU, as in qui, que, cuando, quel. It also survives in English as WH. And the resemblance is easy to see once you know that the original spelling and pronunciation in English was HW, hua. Nobody ever actually said waha. If you listen to older speakers today who still pronounce the H in these question words, you will hear that they put the H before the W. So it's what, why, when. At JPK_Murphy asks, wonder where the word salary originated. So the word salary comes from Latin salarium, which ultimately comes from sal, meaning salt. In ancient Rome, a salarium was a wage paid to somebody so that they could buy salt and other household goods. The word salad ultimately derives from the same root, sal, because a salad was a cold dish that was seasoned with salt. This comes from the etymology subreddit. What's going on with the word child? Why does it pluralize into children rather than child? Child goes all the way back to Old English, which had multiple methods of forming a plural. One of the plurals for the word child in Old English was childru. During Middle English, this became childra. However, at a later moment in time, for some reason, people decided that this didn't look enough like a plural, so they added a second plural ending, n, as in oxen, to create the word children. So it actually has two plural endings stacked on top of each other. It's equivalent to saying childses. De La Rosa JL24 asks, why do we call it deadline for when something is due? What does death have to do with finishing projects on time? So this is a bit of a grisly story. During the American Civil War, a deadline was a literal boundary around a prison that prisoners were not allowed to cross without being in danger of being shot. From that, a deadline came to be used metaphorically to mean a point of no return, and that's where we get the sense of a date on which something is due. JBird3570 asks, why are there multiple words that mean the same thing? There are actually very few true synonyms in English or in other languages. Words that have exactly the same meaning in all contexts. Even if two words appear to have exactly the same meaning, they will tend to be used in somewhat different contexts. For example, big and large. You could say that you have big ideas, you're a big spender, but then you end up in big trouble. However, no one would say that they have large ideas, they're a large spender, or they end up in large trouble. And that's because we're very comfortable using the word big in literal and figurative contexts, but we prefer to use the word large only with its literal meaning. Sometimes multiple synonyms exist because of language borrowing. For example, in English, we have the words kingly, royal, and regal. They all mean the same thing, but kingly comes from English king, royal comes from French roi, meaning king, and regal comes from Latin rex, also meaning king. DWorkPhone asks, is there any reason for the alphabet being in the order it's in? The clue is in the name. The word alphabet comes from alpha beta, which are the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, and they correspond to Latin A and B. Exactly how the letters ended up in this order, A, B, C, or alpha, beta, gamma, or A, B, K, or A, B, G, is not known. It might have been random to an extent, but it's also worth noting that a lot of these sounds are the first sounds that human babies make when they first start babbling. Ba, ba, ga, ga, ka, ka, da, da. The Latin alphabet ultimately derives from the Greek alphabet, which in turn ultimately derives from the Phoenician alphabet. And in all of these alphabets, the letter order starts out in the same way, although the sounds attached to those letters aren't exactly the same. When the Latin alphabet spread to other languages in Europe and beyond, they tended to keep the same order of letters. This is a question from Quora. Why do some languages have formal and informal versions of you, but English does not? There's a bit of backstory to this question. Initially, English had two second-person plural pronouns, thou and you. Thou was for addressing a singular person. You was for addressing more than one person. However, over time, because of the influence of French, in which the plural pronoun vous can also be used as a polite pronoun, you became a respectful way of addressing a single person as well. And at that point, thou started to fall out of use, because if you was the respectful way of addressing one person, then if you called someone thou, it implied that you disrespected them. So after that happened, thou eventually fell out of the language. So English was left with you as its only second-person plural. Obviously, the problem with this is you can no longer easily distinguish between singular and plural. What some people have since done is they have coined new second-person plural pronouns like your and yins in Pittsburgh and yous, which is used in Scotland and Ireland and some other places. Bouncem asks, why do we say it's raining cats and dogs but not any other animals? There are a couple of theories about where this expression came from. Some people say that it's because medieval people used to keep their livestock and pets on the roof, and during heavy rain they would fall through the thatch. Seems unlikely. Other people say it's because during heavy rains, dead animals in the gutters of London would float down the streets. But it's worth noting that there is an earlier idiom, which is they agree like cats and dogs, which means two people don't agree at all. They're constantly fighting. So it's possible that that meaning then informed the expression, it's raining cats and dogs, as in, it's raining so hard, it's like the weather is fighting outside. Yokonaut asks, does the language you speak make you feel and think differently? And if, how so? So Linguistic determinism is the technical term for the belief that the language we speak fundamentally controls and limits the way we can think. In the strong form, this obviously isn't true. If it were true, we would never be able to learn a new concept unless we already knew the word for them. And we also wouldn't be able to learn a second language unless its vocabulary mapped exactly onto our first language. But there is a weaker version of this hypothesis called linguistic relativity, which is just the suggestion that, yeah, maybe language does affect the way we think to an extent. And there is some evidence for this. For example, some linguists did a study where they showed native speakers of German and Spanish a series of pictures of objects. And it just so happened that those objects had names in Spanish and German that had different grammatical genders in the two languages. And what they found was when they asked speakers of those languages to describe the objects they saw, the speakers would tend to use adjectives that reflected certain cultural gender stereotypes. So, for example, they showed them a picture of a bridge. In Spanish, a bridge is puente, which is masculine, and Spanish speakers tended to describe the picture they saw as big and strong. But when they showed the same picture to German speakers, for whom bridge is Brücke, which is feminine, those speakers tended to say that the bridge was beautiful or elegant. So clearly there is some bias that goes into how we think about language, but this doesn't mean that a speaker of German would be incapable of imagining a bridge as masculine. Sometimes you see posts on social media of people saying, here's this word in my language that is untranslatable into other languages. Welsh word hireth, which means a sense of longing for something, possibly home, possibly something else. But the thing is, you can actually translate these words into other languages. I just translated hireth into English. I just have to use a sentence rather than an individual word. But clearly, we can translate concepts from one language into another. Just because we don't have a direct single word for it doesn't mean that we can't fully grasp what it means in another language. And if we really want to, we can always just borrow that word from another language into our own. AXDAJQ asks, why do we say break a leg to wish someone good luck? Wouldn't breaking a leg be the opposite of good luck? The expression break a leg originates in the theatre, where superstitious actors thought it was bad luck to wish someone good luck and good luck to wish someone bad luck. Derek at the Chase asks, I am curious, how do etymologists / wordsmiths determine the pronunciation of Old English words? Thinking emoji. So there are a number of ways etymologists do this. One thing is that luckily Old English was a lot more phonetic in its writing system than modern English is. There was a much closer match between how words were spelled and how they were pronounced. Old English also borrowed its alphabet from Latin, and it happens that a lot of the sounds those letters had in Latin are the same sounds they then have in Old English, which makes it a lot easier. We know what modern German and Dutch sound like. We know what modern English sounds like. So from that, we can reconstruct what earlier forms of words in those languages might have sounded like and how they might have diverged based on regular processes of sound change. For example, we have the word night. In modern English, it's spelled N-I-G-H-T. In Old English, it was typically spelled N-I-H-T. We know that the German word for night is Nacht, which has this vida-fricative sound at the end. And so based on the spelling in Old English and the fact that this vida-fricative sound has survived in other Germanic languages, we can conclude that in Old English, night was pronounced nicht. Jake Unusual asks, how do new words form, get approved, and get added in the dictionary? Okay. This is volume 1 of the OED. It goes from A to Bazooki. I couldn't bring the whole thing with me because it is 20 volumes long. The Oxford English Dictionary is an attempt to document every word, pretty much, used in the English language from the year 1150 to the present day, which is why it keeps getting longer and longer. So in theory, words should never be taken out of the Oxford English Dictionary, although in practice, sometimes they are. So this is basically the mother of all dictionaries in English. Any word that enters the language and gets used by enough people and stays in the language for long enough will be added to the OED eventually. Quo210 asks, why do Americans say the bee's knees to refer to something amazing? The bee's knees originated in the 1920s in flapper culture. That's when women wore long necklaces and short dresses. Bee's knees was one of a number of phrases that people used to suggest that something was beyond compare. Another one is cat's pajamas, which still survives, but there are also a host of others that we no longer use, like the eel's ankle, the sardine's whiskers, and the elephant's instep, which I think we should bring back. This question comes from the No Stupid Questions subreddit. Why the f*** are pineapples called pineapples when they ain't got to do with pine or apples? So pineapple originally meant a pine cone, and when Europeans first encountered pineapples, they thought they resembled pine cones. That's where the word comes from. But the apple is basically the default fruit that Europeans use for talking about new fruit they've encountered in other parts of the world. So a potato used to be known as an earth apple, which is modeled after French pomme de terre. A tomato used to be called a love apple. No idea why. Don't know what it has to do with love. This is from the Ask Social Science subreddit. Why did we stop using words like thou and hath and words with eth on the end? So words like hath, doth, goeth, words that end with th reflect the original way of marking a verb to show that it had a third person singular subject in English. So he goeth, she hath, it doth. Round about the Middle English period, this eth started to fall out of use and it was replaced by s. So she has, he has, it does, which is still the form we use today. Today, we most associate words like hath with the works of William Shakespeare or the King James Bible. But interestingly, even though the word hath was commonly spelled around this time in the early 1600s, it had already fallen out of use in the spoken language. So we actually have a spelling book from this time that tells young students that although we write the word hath and doth, we pronounce them as if they were written with an S, has and does. So this is an instance where writing has taken longer to catch up with the spoken language. Busy Consequence 697 asks, do people rarely use those funny collective nouns, murder of crows, etc.? I mean, I guess people can use these words if they're feeling whimsical enough. So these collective nouns started out life in the Middle Ages as hunting terms. That's where we get phrases like a gaggle of geese, a herd of deer, and a siege of herons. They quickly spread to other domains of use, often with humorous intentions. So the 15th century Book of St. Albans, for example, gives us a long list of collective nouns, including a drunkenship of cobblers, an eloquence of lawyers, and a superfluity of nuns. Neurotic Parents asks, how did the word okay come to be used in so many languages with practically the same meaning and pronunciation? Okay originated as an abbreviation of all correct in the US in the 19th century. There is a theory that originated in the army where a particular general used to sign off documents as okay because he didn't know how to spell all correct properly. We don't have any evidence of that, and it seems more likely that it was a deliberate joking misspelling of the words to indicate that actually things were just adequate rather than entirely satisfactory. The first evidence we have for it comes from newspapers. This is from the Ask Historians subreddit. Did people actually talk how Shakespeare wrote? Yes and no. Putting aside the fact that Shakespeare wrote in rhyme and iambic pentameter a lot of the time, he also lived at a time of intense linguistic creativity. So writers of all kinds were eager to coin new words or use old words in new ways. So much so that some people actually complained about this and objected to the rise of what they called inkhorn terms. An inkhorn is a vessel in which you would keep your ink for writing. So an inkhorn term is a word that never had any real life in the language. It's almost as if you've just plucked it straight from your inkwell on the end of your quill. In everyday language, most speakers would not have had such a vast vocabulary or contorted grammar in such unusual ways. At Jesse_Casino asks, Alexa, what's the origin of the word quarantine? Quarantine comes from the French 40, meaning 40, which ultimately comes from a Latin word meaning the same thing. Originally, a quarantine was a period of 40 days set aside for a special purpose, like fasting. It then changed to mean a period during which somebody was isolated from a community to prevent the spread of disease. A Quora user asks, how do words change meaning over time? Semantic change is a regular feature of all living languages. There are a number of common processes through which words change their meaning. One process is narrowing, which is when a word's meaning becomes more specific. So, for example, the word girl in Old English meant a child of any gender, but then its meaning narrowed to mean only a female child. The opposite process is broadening, which is when a word's meaning becomes more general. For instance, the word bird used to mean a little chick, a nestling, a fledgling, and it was only later that it came to mean a fowl of any age. And at that point, it started to replace the word fowl in the rest of the English language. Another process is amelioration, which is when a word's meaning becomes more positive over time. The word nice originally meant foolish. It then came to mean fussy, then it came to mean meticulous, then it came to mean delicate, then it came to mean attractive. The opposite process to amelioration is pejoration, which is when a word gains a more negative meaning. So kind of in the opposite process to the word nice, the word silly used to mean holy or blessed. It then came to mean innocent or harmless, then it came to mean helpless, and then it came to mean foolish. This is from the Etymology subreddit. Why does cow, pig, sheep all have different names when referring to them as food, beef, pork, lamb, but chicken, fish, or rabbit stay the same? The words beef, pork, and mutton were borrowed into English from French after the Normans invaded England. At that point in time, French became the language spoken by the nobility. The author Walter Scott suggested that the reason we had these pairs of native English words like cow, sheep, and pig versus French words for the meat, so beef, pork, and mutton, had to do with the fact that English-speaking peasants would raise these livestock and then they would be eaten by the French-speaking nobility. The reason that rabbit doesn't have a separate word is that there was no native English word for rabbit because they didn't exist in England until the Normans brought them over. Tiny Werewolf 4650 asks, why aren't English words pronounced as the way they are written? There are a couple of reasons that English pronunciation differs from English spelling. One is sound change. Words have changed their pronunciation over time, but we haven't updated the spelling to match. Another reason is language borrowing. So English has borrowed a lot of words from other languages that have their own different spelling systems, and sometimes these spelling systems have been partly imported into English. For example, in English, words that have ph pronounced f, like physics or phlegm, are all borrowed from Greek, where there is no letter F. Another reason is folk etymology, which is when people change the spelling or pronunciation of a word due to an erroneous belief that it's related to another word. So a good example of this is the word island. Island comes from Old English Eland. It did not have an S in Old English, but during the Middle English period, English borrowed another word meaning the same thing from French, île, which English now pronounces isle. The reason that île or isle has an S in it is that the French word ultimately derives from the Latin word insular. So people thought, well, there's an S in insular, therefore we should put an S in isle, even though the S was always silent in English and in French. And once this had taken place, people thought, wait a minute, we have these two words, isle and island. They must be related. And so they inserted a silent S into the word island as well, even though historically there is no reason for it to be there. Mech HR asks, why is it that some sayings between certain languages are the same? There could be two reasons why two languages have very similar idioms. One could be because there are some basic metaphors that many languages share. For example, the Spanish idiom echar leña al fuego means literally to throw wood on the fire. In English, we would say to add fuel to the flames, but they both mean the same basic thing, which is to make a bad situation worse. The reason they could be so similar is just that the idea that conflict or danger equals fire is one that is found as a basic metaphor in many languages. Another reason that languages could have similar idioms is because one language has just literally translated an idiom from another language. A Quora user asks, why is the word muscle pronounced muscle? So muscle is one of a group of words in English where there's a silent letter in the base word, but then that letter gets pronounced in an adjective form. Other words in this category include condemn to condemnation and phlegm to phlegmatic. The reason for this has to do with rules around syllable structures in English. There are certain combinations of consonants that are not allowed to occur together at the beginning or an end of an English syllable. So for instance, the sound sequence muscle, SCL, is not really permitted in English syllable structures, so instead we drop the C. However, in the word muscular, a U is added to the middle of the word, and that breaks up the syllable boundary so that now we have muscular. That consonant cluster no longer exists. The word muscle comes from Latin musculus, which literally translates as little mouse. Apparently the Romans thought that muscles looked like small critters running up and down your skin. Ed Lincoln 6 says, words with the same spelling and pronunciation, but different etymologies. So these would be known as homonyms. For instance, bat as in the winged creature and bat as in the stick of wood. Some of these are true homonyms, as in they come from separate roots, but actually a lot of words that look like homonyms do share a root. For example, bank as in a riverside and bank, the place where you keep your money. These actually derive from the same Germanic root, which originally meant a slope. From there it came to mean a shoreline, the land sloping down to a river, and also a counter on which you would exchange money. Colombo Sabani asks, how do etymologists even find out the meaning of the words? How do they know where to look back to? So it is rare for words to appear out of nowhere. A new word is often a blend or a compound of two existing words, or it's an existing word that's changed. A noun has become a verb, or an adjective has become a noun. If none of those cases apply, then an etymologist will look at other languages that the word might have been borrowed from, and they'll try to trace back the earliest known use of that particular word. What an etymologist will have to do is to compare the word they're looking at to other words in languages they know to be related, and then reconstruct from the evidence what an earlier form of that word might have been. For example, an etymologist would work out that the word disaster in English comes from Italian disastro. From there, they would work work out that dis is a negative prefix, astro means star, so disaster or disastro literally means an event that happens under a bad star. Chitongi asks, what is that R-like sound I hear between vowels when you say something like did you eat, but sounds like did you eat? Or the idea of blah blah when meaning the idea of. So this is known as intrusive R, and it's a way of resolving vowel hiatus. So vowel hiatus is when two vowels in separate syllables come together without a consonant separating them. English speakers are very uncomfortable about this, and so when it happens, we'll often insert an R to break up the hiatus. So for example, this ice cream tastes banana-y. So people will insert an R as a way of avoiding the vowels being together. For instance, in an expression like Africa and Asia. RDF Porcazzo asks, why is the letter R pronounced so differently in each language? So the letter R can be pronounced as an approximant R, as an alveolar trill R, as a uvular trill R, or as a tap R. And that's just in languages in Western Europe. It's thought that in the Middle Ages, most Western European languages used an alveolar trill, rrr. However, in the early modern period, the uvular trill, r, started to become fashionable in France and then later in Germany. And in English, around the same time, the trill, r, was replaced with the approximant r, which is easier to say, although it doesn't sound as good. One of the major reasons for sound change is ease of articulation, that and changing fashions. There is often no more logic to it than that. I hope you learned something today. Thanks for listening. See you next time.